The Adventure of Oliver Twist, Chapter 2. Traits of Oliver Twist's Growth, Education, and Board. For the next 8 or 10 months, Oliver was the victim of a systematic course of treachery and deception. He was brought up by the hand. The hungry and destitute situation of the infant orphans was duly reported by the workhouse authorities to the parish authorities. The parish authorities inquired with dignity of the workhouse authorities whether there was no female then domiciled in the house who was in a situation or in part to Oliver Twist, the consolidation and the nourishment of which he stood in need. The workhouse authorities replied with humility that there was not. Upon this, the parish authorities magnanimously and humanely resolved that Oliver should be farmed, or in other words, that he should be dispatched to Branch's workhouse, some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rolled about the floor all day without inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing under the parental superintendence of an elderly female, who received the culprits at and for the consideration of 7 halfpence per small head per week. 7 halfpence worth per week is a good round diet for a child. A great deal may be got for 7 halfpenny, require enough to overload its stomach and make it uncomfortably. The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for children, and she had a very accurate perceptions of what was good for herself. So she appropriated the great part of a weekly stipend to her own use, and consigned the rising parochial generation to even a shorter allowance than was originally provided for them, thereby finding in the lowest depths of deeper still, and providing herself a very great experimental philosopher. Everybody knows the story of another experimental philosopher who had a great theory about a horse being able to live without eating, and who demonstrated it so well that he got his own horse down to a straw a day, and would most unquestionable have rendered him a very spirit and rampacious animal on nothing at all if he had not died, just 24 hours before he was to have had his first comfortable bit of air. Unfortunately, for the experimental philosophy of the female to whom protecting care Oliver Twist was delivered over, a similar result yearly attended the operation of her system. For at the very moment when a child had contrived to exist upon the smallest possible portion of the weakest possible food, it did perversely happen 8.5 cases out of 10, 8 that it sickened from want and cold, or fell into the fire from neglect, or got half smothered by accident, in any one of which cases the miserable little being was yearly summoned into another world, and there gathered to the fathers which it had never known in it. Occasionally, when there was some more than usually interesting inquest upon a parish child who had been overlooked in turning up a bedstead, or inadvertently scalded to a death when here happened to be a washing, though the latter accident was very scarce, anything approaching to a washing being of a real occurrence in the farm. The July would take it into their heads, or ask troublesome questions. All the parishioners would rebelliously affix their signature to a remonstrance, but those impertinence was speedily checked by the evidence of a surgeon, and the testimony of the battle, the former of whom had always opened the body and found nothing inside, which was very probably indeed, and the latter of whom invariably saw whatever the parish wanted, which was very self-devotional. Besides, the board made periodical pilgrimage to the farm and always sent the beadle the day before to see they were going. The children would knit and cling to behold when they went, and what more would the people have? It cannot be expected that this system of the farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxurious crop. Oliver Twist's nice birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference. But nature or inheritance had implanted a good, sturdy spirit in Oliver's breast. It had had plenty room to expand, thanks to the spare diet of establishment, and perhaps to these circumstances may be attributed his having any nice birthday at all. Be this as it may, however, it was his nice birthday, and he was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, who, after participating with him in the sound thrashing, had been locked up therein for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beadle, striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate. "Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir?" said Mrs. Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in well-affected ecstasies of joy. "Susan, take Oliver and them 2 brabs upstairs and wash them directly. My heart alive, Mr. Bumble, how glad I'm to see you, surely." Now, Mr. Bumble was a fat man and choleric, so instead of responding to this open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicket a tremendous shake, and then bestowed upon it a kick which could have emanated from no leg, but Battles. "Lord, only think," said Mrs. Mann, running out, for the 3 boys had been removed by this time. "Only think of that I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on the inside, on account of them dear children. Walk in, sir, walk in. Pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir." Although this invitation was accompanied with a courtesy that might have softened the heart of church warden, it by no means mollified the beadle. "Do you think this respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann?" inquired Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane. "To keep the parish officers awaiting at your garden gate when they come here upon parochial business connected with the parochial offense? Are you aware, Mrs. Mann, that you are, as I may see, a parochial delegate and stipendiary? I'm sure, Mr. Bumble, that I'm only attending 1 or 2 of the dear children, as it so fond of you, that it was you a-coming," replied Mrs. Mann with great humility. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his rhetorical power and his importance. He had displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed. Well, Mrs. Mann," he replied in a calmer tone. "It may be as you say, it may be. Lead the way in, Mrs. Mann, for I come on business and have something to say." Mrs. Mann ushered the beadle into a small parlor with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked head and the cane on the table before him. Mr. Bumble wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his walk had generated, glanced complacently at the cocked head, and smiled. Yes, he smiled. Battles a butt man, and Mr. Bumble smiled. "Now, don't you be offended at what I'm going to say," observed Mrs. Mann with captivating sweetness. "You had a long walk, you know. or I wouldn't mention it. Now, will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble? Not a drop, not a drop, said Mr. Bumble, waving his right hand in a dignified but pleasant manner. I think you will, said Mrs. Ma'am, who had noticed the tone of the refusal and the gesture that had accompanied it. Just a little drop, with a little cold water and a lump of sugar. Mr. Bumble coughed. No, just a little drop, said Mrs. Ma'am, persuasively. What is it? Inquired the beetle. Battle? Why, it's when I'm obliged to keep a little of in the house to put into the blessed infants. Duffy? When they ain't well, Mr. Bumble, replied Mrs. Ma'am, as she opened the corner cupboard and took down a bottle and a glass. It's Jane. I will not deceive you, Mr. B. It's Jane. Do you give the children Duffy, Mrs. Ma'am? Inquired Bumble, following with his eyes the interesting process of mixing. Oh, bless them, that I do, dear as it is, replied the nurse. I couldn't see them suffer before my very eyes, you know, sir. No, said Mrs. Bumble approvingly. No, you could not. You are human women, Mrs. Ma'am. Here, she set down the glass. I shall take an early opportunity of mentioning it to the board, Mrs. Ma'am. He drew it towards him. You feel as a mother, Mrs. Ma'am. He stirred the gin and water. I drink your health with cheerfulness, Miss Ma'am. And he swallowed half of it. And now about a business, said the Bendel, taking out of a leathern pocketbook. The child that was half baptized Oliver Twist is 9 years old today. Bless him, interposed Mrs. Ma'am, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. And notwithstanding offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, notwithstanding the most superlative, and I may say superlative exertions on the part of his parish, said Bumble. We have never been able to discover who is his father or what was his mother's settlement, name, or condition. Mrs. Ma'am raised her hands in astonishment, but added after a moment's reflection, How comes he to have any names at all, then? The Battle drew himself up with great pride and said, I invented it. You, Mr. Bumble? I, Mrs. Mann. We named our foundling in alphabetical order. The last was a Swabble. I named him. This was a T Twist. I named him. The next one, as comes, will be Wing, and the next, Wilkins. I have not names ready made to the end of the alphabet, and all the way through it again when we come to Z. Why, you are quite a literary character, sir, said Mrs. Mann. Well, said the Battle, evidently gratified with the compliment. Perhaps I may be, perhaps I may be, Mrs. Mann. He finished the gin and water, added, Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board had determined to have him back into the house. I have come out myself to take him there, so let me see him at once. I will fetch him directly, said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose. Oliver, having had by this time as much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands, removed as could be scrabbled off in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver, said Mrs. Mann. Oliver made a bow, which was divided between the Battles on the chair and the cocked hat on the table. Will you go along with me, Oliver? Said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Oliver was about to say that he would go along with anybody with great readiness, when glancing upwards, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the Battle's chair and was shaking her fist at him with a furious countenance. He took the hint at once, for the first had been too often impressed upon his body not to be deeply impressed upon his recollection. Will she go with me? Inquired poor Olive. No, she can't, replied Mr. Bumble, but she will come and see you sometimes. This was not very great consolidation to the child. Young as he was, however, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was not a very difficult matter for the boy to call the tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill usage are great assistants if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 embraces, and what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter, lest he should seem too hungry when he got to the workhouse. With a slice of bread in his hand, and the little brown cloth parish cap on his head, Oliver was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lightened the gloom of his infant years. And yet he burst into the agony of a childish grief as the cottage gate closed after him. Wrenched as were the little companies in misery he was leaving behind, they were the only friend he had ever known, and the sense of his loneliness in the great wide world sank into the child's heart for the first time. Mr. Bumble walked on with long strides, little Oliver firmly grasping his gold-laced cuff, trotted beside him, inquiring at the end of every quarter of a mile whether they were nearly there. To those interrogations, Mr. Bumble returned a very brief and snappish reply, for the temporary blandness which gin and water awakens in some bosoms had by this time evaporated, and he was once again at battle. Oliver had not been within the walls of the workhouse a quarter of an hour, and had scarcely completed the demolition of a second slice of bread, when Mr. Bumble, who had handed him over to the care of the old woman, returned, and telling him it was a board night, informed him that the board had said he was to appear before it forthwith. Not having a very clearly definite notion of what a live board was, Oliver was rather astounded by this intelligence, and was not quite certain whether he ought to laugh or cry. He had no time to think about the matter, however, for Mr. Bumble gave him a tap on the head with his cane to wake him up, and another on the back to make him lively, and bidding him follow, conducted him into a large whitewashed room where 8 or 10 fat gentlemen were sitting around the table. At the top of the table, seated in an armchair rather higher than the rest, was a particularly fat gentleman with a very round, red face. "Bow to the board," said Bumble. Oliver brushed away 2 or 3 tears that were lingering in his eyes, and seeing no board but the table, fortunately bowed to that. "What's your name, boy?" said the gentleman in the high chair. Oliver was frightened at the sight of so many gentlemen, which made him tremble, and the beadle gave him another tap behind, which made him cry. And those 2 causes made him answer in a very low and hesitating voice, whereupon a gentleman in a white waistcoat said he was a fool, which was a capital way of raising his spirits and putting him quite at his ease. "Boy," said the gentleman in the high chair, "listen to me. You know you are orphaned, I suppose?" "What's that, sir?" inquired poor Oliver. "The boy is a fool. I thought he was," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "Hush," said the gentleman who had spoken first. "You know you have got no father or mother, and that you were brought up by a parish, don't you?" "Yes, sir," replied Oliver, weeping bitterly. "What are you crying for?" inquired the gentleman in the white waistcoat, and to be sooth, it was very extraordinary. What could the boy be crying for? "I hope you see your prayers every night," said another gentleman in a gruff voice, "and pray for the people who feed you and take care of you like a Christian." "Yes, sir," stammered the boy. The gentleman who spoke last was unconsciously right. it would have been very like a Christian, and marvelously good Christian too, if Oliver had prayed for the people who fed and took care of him, but he hadn't, because nobody had taught him. Well, you have come here to be educated and taught a useful trade, said the red-faced gentleman in the high chair. So you will begin to pick oakum tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, added the surly one in the white waistcoat. For the combination of both those blessings in the one simple process of picking oakum, Oliver bowed low by the direction of the battle, and was then hurried away to a large ward, where on the rough, hard bed he sobbed himself to sleep. What a noble illustration of the tender laws of England. They let the paupers go to sleep. Poor Oliver, he little thought, as he lay sleeping in the happy unconsciousness of all around him, that the board had that very day arrived at a decision which would exercise the most material influence over all his future fortunes. But they had, and this was it. The members of this board were very sage, deep, philosophical men. And when it came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once what ordinary folks would never have discovered. The poor people like it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poor classes, a tavern where there was nothing to pay, and public breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper all the year round. A brick and a mortar, a Elysium, where it was all play and no work. "Oh ho," said the board, looking very knowing. "We are the fellows to set this to rights. We will stop it all in no time." So they established a rule that all poor people should have the alternative, for they would compel nobody, not they, of being starved by a gradual process in the house or by a quick one out of it. With this view, they contracted with the waterworks to lay on an unlimited supply of water, and with a core factor to supply periodically small quantities of oatmeal, and issued 3 meals of thin gruel a day, with an onion twice a week, and half a roll on Sundays. They made a great many other wise and human regulations, having references to the ladies, which it is not necessary to repeat. Kindly undertook to divorce poor married people, in consequences of the great expense of a suit in Doctors' Commons. And instead of compelling a man to support his family as they had theretofore done, took his family away from him and made him a bachelor. There is no saying how many applicants for relief under those 2 last hands might have started up in all classes of society if it had not been coupled with the workhouse. But the board were long-handed men and have provided for this difficulty. The relief was inseparable from the workhouse and the gruel, and that frightened people. For the first 6 months after Oliver Twist was removed, the system was in full operation. It was rather expensive at first, in consequence of an increase in the undertaker's bill, and the necessity of taking in the clothes of all the paupers, which fluttered loosely on their waists, and shrunken forms after a week or 2's grew. But the number of workhouse inmates got thin, as well as the pauper and the board were in ecstasies. The room in which boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose, and assisted by 1 or 2 women, ladled the gruel at meal times. Of these festival compositions, each boy had 1 porringer, and no more, except the occasion of a great public rejoicing, when he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread besides. The bowls never wanted washing. The boys polished them with their spoons till they shone again. And when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, the spoons being nearly as large as the bowl, they would sit staring at the copper, with each eager eyes as if they could have devoured the very bricks which it was composed, employing themselves meanwhile in sucking their fingers most assiduously with a view of catching up any stray splashes of glue that might have been cast thereon. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last, they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age, hadn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cook's shop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next to him, who happened to be a weakly youth of a tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held. Lots were cast who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more, and it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and the long grace was set over the short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered to each other and winked at Oliver, while his next neighbors nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and, advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralyzed with wonder, the boy with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's hand with a ladle, pinpointed him with his arms, and shrieked aloud for the battle. The board was sitting in the solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement and, addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said, "Mr. Limberkin, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance. "For more?" said Mr. Limberkin. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hung," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung." Nobody controverted the prophetic gentleman's opinion. An animated discussion took place. Oliver was ordered into instant confinement, and a bill was next morning posted on the outside of a gate, offering a reward of £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. In other words, £5 and Oliver Twist were offered to any man or woman who wanted apprentice to any trade, business, or calling. "I never was more convinced of anything in my life," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat as he knocked at the gate and read the bill next morning. "I never was more convinced of anything in my life than I am that boy will come to be hung." As I propose to show in the sequel whether the white waistcoated gentleman was right or not, I should perhaps mar the interest of this narrative, supposing it to possess any at all, if I venture to hint, just yet, whether the life of Oliver Twist had this violent termination or no.